Los Angeles, one of the most emblematic cities in the United States, has recently become a true urban battlefield. What began as peaceful protests against the arrest of illegal immigrants quickly degenerated in a wave of violence, looting, and destruction. The images that circulated on social networks and in the press showed chaotic scenes. Showcases being broken, burned cars, clashes between protesters and police forces. The trigger for this chaos was an immigration operation conducted by the ICE that resulted in the detention of several immigrants, arousing the revolt of a significant part of the population, especially in neighborhoods with strong Latin presence. The emotional response, fueled by a history of racial tensions and controversial migratory policies of the Trump administration, has inflamed the city. Faced with the inability of the local police to contain the disorders, the federal government decided to intervene. President Donald Trump resorted to a legal mechanism called the National Guard federalization. This means that the California National Guard troops, usually subordinate to the state governor, began to respond directly to the President of the United States. The decision was made by the Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who from the beginning was positioned against any type of federal intervention. However, the severity of the protests and the risks increasing to public safety, especially around federal buildings, led Trump to take an even bolder step, to order the shipping of Marines to Los Angeles. More than 700 members of the 1st Division of Marines, were sent to the Los Angeles metropolitan area with the mission of protecting federal properties and reinforcing the National Guard. It is important to understand the weight of this decision. Naval Marines are an elite force of the U.S. Armed Forces, trained for lethal combat, invasion missions, and operations in war zones. Now these soldiers patrolled the streets of an American city, surrounded by civilians, in a scenario where the risk of confrontations was very high. For many analysts, the use of combat troops in a civil context represents an institutional, legal, and even moral risk. Governor Gavin Newsom reacted immediately. Trump's decision called an unacceptable violation of state sovereignty. According to him, the president would be politically exploring the crisis to impose himself on a state ruled by a Democratic opponent. Newsom's reaction was not just in the speech. He filed a lawsuit against the federal government, arguing that there was not sufficient legal justification for military intervention and that the situation, although tense, was being controlled by state authorities. The conflict then left the streets and also entered the courts, starting an institutional battle between the California state government and the White House. With armed federal troops on the streets, expanding clashes and political disputes gaining volume, the Los Angeles crisis is no longer just a public safety problem. It became a test to the limits of the United States Constitution and for the delicate balance of power between states and the federal government. The tension has spread beyond California's borders, feeding heated debates in Congress, universities, social networks, and throughout the American media. With troops already positioned on the streets of Los Angeles and the tension between state and federal government boiling, a delicate chapter began to draw: the legal and constitutional clash on the limits of presidential power. Donald Trump's decision to federalize the National Guard and, especially, to send active troops from the Marines to Californian territory without the consent of the governor, aroused strong criticism from jurists, parliamentarians, and defenders of civil liberties. The United States Constitution, through the Comitatus Possession Law of 1878, severely restricts the use of armed forces in police operations within the country. This law exists precisely to protect the civilian population from the militarization of public space and prevent abuses of authority by the federal government. There is, however, a remarkable exception to the rule: the 1807 Insurrection Act. This legislation allows the president to use armed forces to restore order in cases of insurrection, widespread disobedience, or when there is impediments to the application of federal laws. Trump, however, chose not to directly invoke Insurrection Act, which raised even more questions. Instead, he cited a number of other laws with more vague justifications, arguing that his priority was to ensure the safety of federal buildings and civil servants who would be under threat. For critics, this choice was a way to avoid political and legal distress of applying such extreme legislation, but at the same time open margin for a series of conflicting legal interpretations. The problem deepened with the absence of clear guidelines on the so-called rules of engagement, i.e. when and how the military could use the force against civilians. The lack of transparency in this regard generated a huge concern. Troops like Marines are trained to face armed enemies, not to act in popular demonstrations. Combat logic, based on the elimination of threats, does not fit into the context of civil disorders, where the limits between violence and peaceful protest are often clouded. This disconnection between military mission and urban reality increased the risk of serious incidents, such as violent repressions or even civil deaths. In Congress, polarization has reached maximum levels. Representatives of the Democratic Party accused the president of turning the crisis into an authoritarian tool, using the military apparatus to shut up opponents and intimidate states with Democratic leadership. For many, the intervention was less about public safety and more about sending a message of strength and control. On the other hand, Republican parliamentarians, especially the most aligned with Trump, defended the decision firmly. They claimed that the state government had lost control of the situation and that it was the president's duty to protect the federal heritage and to guarantee the order. According to this view, the military presence was a necessary evil in the face of chaos installed in various regions of the city. Even with the presence of more than 700 Marines and hundreds of members of the National Guard, violence in the streets of Los Angeles did not cease immediately. New episodes of looting and clashes were recorded. Governor Gavin Newsom insisted that the state had the means and the ability to contain protests without external intervention. He publicly declared that the military presence only inflamed the spirits and endangered the safety of the population. The federal government, in turn, maintained the pressure. In addition to the Marines already highlighted, it authorized the sending of another 1,700 members of the National Guard, further increasing the city's militarization. This climb led analysts to rescue historical parallels. In 1992, after the case Rodney King, the National Guard was fired in Los Angeles with the consent of the state government. Also during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, federal troops were mobilized, but in contexts in which the governors opposed the compliance with the federal laws of this creation. The current case, however, is different. The governor not only did not request help, but formally opposed the presence of troops. This detail transforms intervention into something unprecedented recent, debating the balance of powers within the federative structure of the United States. The crisis in Los Angeles, therefore, was no longer just about immigration, vandalism, or public safety. It became a political and institutional framework, a moment when the limits of presidential power, the strength of state opposition were tested, and, above all, the resistance of American democracy in the face of an internal threat not from outside, but from within its own mechanisms of power. Violent protests in Los Angeles outlined after arrests related to an operation against illegal immigration, generating revolt and vandalism actions. The feeling of injustice spread rapidly by immigrant and supportive communities, gaining strength on the streets and taking proportions that local administration had difficulty controlling. President Donald Trump's response was immediate and blunt. He decided to send the California National Guard using the federalization mechanism, which removes control of the governor on this force. A legally allowed but rarely used maneuver, precisely because of its tension potential between the federal government and the states. But it didn't stop there. As the protests intensified and began to directly threaten federal facilities and ICE agents, Trump made an even more controversial decision. He authorized the sending of regular troops from the armed forces, more precisely, Marines 1st Division Marines. More than 700 highly trained soldiers were moved to the Los Angeles metropolitan area, with the mission of protecting federal buildings and reinforcing the work of the National Guard. It was an unprecedented measure in recent decades on American soil, a sign that the federal government faced the situation as something far beyond a simple urban disorder. Governor Gavin Newsom of the Democratic Party reacted with indignation. He condemned the decision as a clear violation of state sovereignty and quickly filed a lawsuit against the White House. For him, military intervention was not only unnecessary, but dangerous and politically motivated. The accusation was direct. Trump would be using the crisis as a power tool, trying to weaken a state with a strong Democratic presence and send a message of strength to his electoral base. The dispute began to be fought at multiple levels on the streets, in the cuts, and behind the scenes of Washington. Interestingly, the president avoided using the 1807 Insurrection Act, which would legally allow troops to be used in cases of insurrection. Instead, he preferred a more vague justification, citing a collection of laws that authorized the protection of federal functions and properties. This choice raised more doubts than certainty. Jurists pointed out that, by formally not to invoke the act of the insurrection, Trump opened margin for contestation of the legality of the operation. The main criticism revolved around the lack of clarity about what exactly the troops could or could not do. What would be the rules of engagement? When could a Marine use lethal force against a civilian? These questions remained unanswered. Political polarization has reached the apex. Democrats accused the Trump administration of authoritarianism and militarization of internal policy. Republicans, especially allies of the president, praised the decision as a measure of courage and firmness to restore order. They argued that the integrity of federal agents and institutions could not be at the mercy of vandalisms and riots. Even so, military climbing did not bring immediate results. Violence persisted in several areas, and the federal government, instead of retreating, doubled the bet. 1,700 members of the National Guard were sent to reinforce the contingent already on the field. Faced with the permanence of chaos and the growing military presence, the crisis became a larger symbol. The debate was no longer just about immigration, public safety, or vandalism, but about the very foundations of the U.S. Republic. What is the limit of federal power over states? To what extent can a president use military forces within the national territory without the endorsement of local authorities? These questions gained breathtaking among experts and historians, who began to compare the crisis with crucial moments in U.S. history. Among the few preceding are the 1992 racial riots, when the National Guard was used with the consent of the state government, and the 1960s, when federal troops were sent to guarantee the civil rights of African American in segregationist states. But this time, the absence of a formal request for help from the governor and the loaded political context made Trump's action even more controversial. Many saw in it a gesture of demonstration of strength, an attempt to centralize power and redefine the limits of presidential authority. What is at stake is not only control of the streets of Los Angeles, but the balance between powers in the United States. While the city is still trying to recover from the physical and emotional damage of the protests, the country as a whole is faced with an institutional crossroads. The case will be marked in history as a watershed, not only by the flames on the streets, but for the intensity of the conflict between political, military, and constitutional forces in American territory.